Jeff Whitman. I am the director of Prevent Child Abuse Indiana, and I'm thrilled that you've made time to join us this morning and into the early afternoon for this presentation today. This is part of a presentation series. We have one next week. We have one the week after. So if you're not on mute, please mute yourself. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we have
was it Brian? It was 3919 is where it was. So just
thanks, Kathy. We have 3 webinars today, the Friday the 9th and Friday the 16th, all at the same time. So would love to have you come back to join us for all 3. So let's see, I've asked people to mute. I talked about how we're going to have a break in the middle where we can ask questions and at the end. And I think we're at the point where I want to introduce our speaker today. And so we have with us Dr. James Schroeder, and he's going to talk to us on turning distress into joy. Let me give you a little background on Dr. Schroeder. Dr. Schroeder is a PhD child psychologist and vice president of the Department of Psychology and Wellness at Easter Seals Rehabilitation in Evansville, Indiana. He's also the training director of the pre-doctoral internship and postdoctoral fellowship in that department. He resides in Evansville with his wife, Amy, and their 8 children. He received his BS from Ball State University with a major in psychology and minors in social work and counseling psychology. He graduated with a PhD in clinical psychology from St. Louis University in 2005. In addition to seeing youth with a wide range of backgrounds and psychological issues, he specializes in evaluating and working with children and their families diagnosed with autism spectrum, learning, sleep, attention deficit, and other developmental issues. He also writes a monthly column for parents and professionals entitled Just Thinking, which can be found along with many other articles and books on his personal website at www.james-schroeder.com. Dr. Schroeder is a regular radio guest for multiple morning shows. He just completed a year-long podcast entitled Living a Whole Christian Life, which can be found on his website or any other major podcast outlet. So we are grateful to have such an expert among us today and a passionate family man and great resource for child abuse prevention. Dr. Schroeder, I'm going to give this to you right now. I'll be monitoring the chat in the background and just looking forward to a great time together.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate that introduction. And it's really wonderful joining all of you today on this Friday morning. We were joking before you got on the call that we finally have a little sun down here in Evansville, Indiana. We've had about 10 days straight of cloud and gloominess. So I think that it's just kind of a wonderful way. And it is Groundhog's Day. I'm not sure what the groundhog in Poxitani, wherever that's at, said this morning, but hopefully spring is on the way for sure. So we're going to do a few things to start. Let me kind of, number one, I need to share my screen. So let me take care of that here. And let me know. Can everybody see that fine? Thumbs up. That's good. Okay, great. Groundhog said early spring. Wonderful. I love that. There we go. So what we're gonna do is just do a couple things to start off the bat. And before I even really get started, we've got the share screen share. Let's see. Okay. I would like to see if I can get rid of our little icon here. We'll hide that. Before I share a little bit about me, I would love to kind of get started and hear some about you. And I know we've got a great crowd this morning. It looks like we have 74 on right now, and hopefully a few more people coming on in the next few minutes. But I'd love to hear where you're from this morning. I would love to hear what you do, your role, your profession. Maybe you're a parent, you're a foster parent, you're a social worker. It's interesting. As a psychologist, I grew up in a social work household. My dad has been in LCSW for about 45 years. And so I think that although I told everybody I was going into the environmental sciences at Ball State, I realized I don't even know quite that was when I started. And I think I found myself back to where I belong in the world of mental health. So I see we've got people from Elkhart County, Hendricks County, Bloomfield. Actually, my brother had his first paper job at Bloomfield years ago. Tell City, Indiana. I've got a lot of Hagedorns over there that are my family. So that's a great place that we visit regularly. Up in Marion, James Dean, I guess, county or area. And all over Allen County. I love seeing you're all over the state, Lafayette, and so on. So keep that kind of coming. It's wonderful to kind of know that we are really bringing the state together this morning. We're really bringing the professionalism, parenting, and everything together. It's one of the reasons I really love working with this organization is that we have such a great constituency that comes as part of this. And I think we're all working together, which is a common goal towards greater health and harmony and happiness within our population here. So, all right. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to minimize my chat for a second here, and we'll get rolling. All right. So I told you I was going to tell you a little bit about myself, and it starts and ends with the fact that, again, I'm married to my wife, Amy. I'm truly blessed to have my wife and I have been married almost 24 years, actually come July, and we're both from Evansville originally. But very quickly after grad school, our family started to grow. And so in front of you is actually an older picture. This has been a couple of years in the past, but we have 8 kids, as Jeff said earlier, and our oldest are now seniors in high school. So for all of you who've been into the college circuit world and have had that as part of what you do, it is an interesting place to be, but it's neat to see our kids growing. And so we have 2 seniors in high school. We have a sophomore in high school. We have 4 in grade school, and little Kate right in the middle, little Catherine Claire, she is going to be 5 in July. So we have 1 at home. So it's a busy existence. It's a really, really great existence. It's a humbling existence, whether you're a child psychologist or not. But what I really find is that the topic today, turning distress into joy, is super, super important for everything that we do. And so that's why I'm excited to kind of, dive into this today and kind of consider not just how we can use this certainly in our professional lives, but how we can use it in our everyday lives, no matter where you find yourselves. Okay. So as we begin, since the beginning of humanity, people have had struggled with difficult circumstances and experiences, right? From the very beginning, long before the advent of modern medicine and formal psychological practice, individuals use various techniques, both as part of faith and secular traditions, to overcome traumatic events, to improve mood, to decrease anxiety, and develop a greater sense of resiliency for whatever challenges they encounter. Over the past few decades, what's really neat is that research has increasingly indicated these strategies, which are freely available to all, have specific health benefits for an individual's physical, social, and psychological well-being. And studies have indicated that when used strategically and intelligently, they can really unlock healing processes that are both understood and also really mysterious in nature. And we'll talk more about that as we go on. So here's kind of my learning objectives. I want to discuss these time-honored but very research-driven strategies for improving mood, for decreasing anxiety, for improving resiliency, and really kind of helping us. So when I think about, and we'll talk later about one of the books even that I've written, we think about the whole human person. We really have all the psychological, physical, social, and even spiritual aspects that really make up who we are, but they're all integrated. They're not, we should never compartmentalize those and think, oh, I'm just treating a psychological problem, because a psychological difficulty overlays with every other aspect of our life, right? So we're going to focus on that today. I'm going to explain kind of specific keys that are important in using these strategies well. For example, we're going to talk about gratitude today. And people might think, oh, yeah, I know it's important to give thanks or whatever. And I think that that's something that's good to do. But actually, science uncovers that it's not only a good thing to do, but there are specific ways to do it effectively. And then there are things that probably are not as effective. And we're going to talk about that today. And the third thing is we're going to describe practical ways professionals and people in general can apply these techniques to their clinical practice, but also use in their own lives. And I think that's one of the neat things about being a psychologist is that everything that I do really is applicable in many ways to my everyday life. And I think that we should always strive to kind of like bridge the gap between our professional lives and our personal lives in a healthy way. All right, so when we think about components of distress, that's kind of a very catch-all category. There comes a number of potential emotions that can impede joy and contentment in different ways, right? And they can include the following. They can be, sense of sadness, of deep, even despair, a sense of bitterness about things that we have trouble getting past, or things that right now are just really kind of bothering us. It can be a sense of envy or jealousy, ways that we just look at other people and think, why are their lives so much better than mine? Why are they able to do things much more easily? I think a lot of us, myself included, can struggle with envy in our lives. Anxiety, the number one psychological complaint for kids and adolescents in this country and in the world is anxiety. We are an anxious population, an anxious group. And, there's that's a whole other presentation, but a lot of reasons why we experience such anxiety, both through external threats, but also a lot of internal threats these days. We can be, when we're distressed, we can have suspiciousness, right? Distrust. I mean, we've all been in situations where we might want to trust somebody, but it's really, really hard for us to get there. And we might be wary, and we might have good reason. We may have grown up in ways that we just learned that trusting people seemed like too much of a risk. And so that's where we land. We also can have a lot of anger and rage. I mean, anger can be a really productive emotion, but it can be a really deconstructive emotion. And for example, those who suffer with anger across the lifespan and wrath are really increased risk for cardiac problems and many other health issues. So that's something that we struggle with, right? And I think as a dad, I find that times that, you struggle with being angry at your kids because they're not doing quite what you want them to do. And it's a natural emotion, but it can really kind of go on in a negative way. And then I think all of us at times have experienced hopelessness and helplessness, right? Hopelessness comes out of a sense of depression, that we can't see how things can really improve, right? And helplessness comes out of a sense of anxiety right now and not being able to do something with where we're at. And so all of those emotions are really, really common components of distress. And each of them themselves, and I think this is really important to really start with, are just kind of normally part of the human experience. And it's okay in some ways to experience these. It's just that when they take us to places that we don't want to go, and they take us to, do things that we don't want to do, that's when we're beginning to kind of realize that it's something we need to address. And so that's really important. I always, when I talk to kids in session, I talk about there's really 3 questions or 3 rules, which is A, you're allowed to have whatever feelings you have. And that's important that you have those and acknowledge them. And no one should ever try to take away the feelings that you experience. And B, you're allowed to have whatever thoughts you have, even if they're different than other people, even if they're different than your parents, while they're trying to teach you things that are important, because that's your psychological autonomy. That's the way that you grew up and become who you are. But C, we have to be careful about acting in whatever way we want based on how we think and feel. And so we kind of go forward with this idea that we want to be the most adaptive that we can be, no matter what's going on. All right. So in some manner, right, like I said, they're all part of the human experience. They're authentic in who they are. But I would argue to you that each of those emotions on that previous page were never intended to be long-term experiences, but rather they're intended to be conduits to further decisions, growth, and adaptation. There are emotions, and I don't even know if we call these emotions, but things like love and admiration and trust that are really adaptive if you're able to experience them in more of a long-term way. But the emotions on the preceding page, if you experience those chronically, almost always they're going to cause difficulties and challenges, right? And so they're really, when it comes down to it, the emotions that we speak of here are either intended to serve as messengers or informants. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, and maybe you have, but really each emotion, each of those emotions I described, and really all emotions in general, they're either trying to send us a message about something that's important, right? They're either trying to give us information about who we are, our circumstances, or what we need to do, or we are sending them out from ourselves as messengers to other people and to the world, right? And they're used to let others know more about our current state of being, what's important to us, what's going on. And I think we get kind of lost and we forget about this, that all emotions have a purpose. They have a design there. And the honest truth, though, is that we often just wish that they would go away. We wish that, how many times have you been really anxious in your life? I certainly have in mine. I thought, I just want it to go away. I just want it to be done, right? How many times have you seen your kids struggle with their emotional state and you think, please, God, just kind of find a way to get this to pass? And while all of that is very normal, unfortunately, I think that when we do that repeatedly, we often miss a real opportunity for learning and actually an opportunity to grow and even be more joyful, because we don't consider what is the message that the emotion is sending and what is the information, again, what's the informant that's occurring here. And so this is kind of a really key, I think, framework to start off with. That going forward, I think if you take things out of today in this talk, ask yourself in your life going forward, okay, what's the informant? What's the message? What's going on? And I think we do that. It's amazing what it opens up as far as, again, potential for growth. So before we start, though, and we're going to dive into the elements related to turning distress into joy, I wanted to actually highlight a few key strategies that I think create really natural opportunities for health. I bet if I asked all of you on this call today this simple question, if you could be happy and healthy and harmonious and do it completely natural, again, and we're all going to make mistakes or have difficult times or whatever, I don't mean that, but like if you could strive towards that and you could do it totally in a natural way, would you go for it? Would you want, if I could do it without having any medications or anything like that, if my kids could do it, would you want it? Now, again, that's not always possible. And there is a good place for medications in this world, because sometimes no matter what we do, there's just a state of inequity that we need to kind of address. But I would argue that these bullets in front of you, these 7 bullets, if we were to really pursue them and pursue them consistently and continuously, we would be amazed at the natural opportunities that are available for our health and well-being and for everybody around. And so let me just kind of just briefly highlight these, because I think it's really important, and there really is so much richness. And by the way, the website that Jeff mentioned earlier, I've always intended, it's just a place I archive my articles. Oftentimes I publish other sites, and I think there's upwards of 250 plus articles right now that if you search under any kind of theme or idea or tag terms, you're going to pull up articles about these kinds of topics. So please check it out. It's just a resource. And as a parent myself, trying to make things available that I'm working through in my own way too. So, but the article here, by the way, that I pulled this one from it's quote, want to live drug-free question. Well, it's time to live more simply. That was kind of the idea of the answer. Number 1 on the bullet here is to treat your body like the natural wonder it is. And research, and again, this is something I'm happy to come back to PCAIN and talk more about, but research has increasingly indicated a clear connection between nutrition and psychological health, especially as it pertains to areas like attention, behavior, and emotional regulation. I can't, it's amazing, and I've got a lot on my website, but as we see nutrition improving, even slightly, like let's say you have a 100% processed diet right now, and let's say your child or whoever you're working with is 100% processed, even moving to 10% of a natural diet can actually improve things like emotional regulation and attention. So there's a huge amount of potential in this area here. The second bullet talks about create little narratives, kind of like the Civil War journals. I don't know if you're interested in that, like I was certainly growing up and still am. But so many people over the history of the world in difficult times have journaled about these experiences. What we find is that 3+ decades of research indicates significant physical and psychological benefits of expressive writing. And it's really, it's interesting. It seems to be that creating a narrative that makes sense to yourself, even in difficult times, even in a lot of emotional experiences, allows us in some mysterious way to come to grips and come to terms so that we can improve our health. And it's not just like, for example, decreasing anxiety. We found physical benefits related to improved immune functioning or improved lung functioning. And you think, how is that possible through writing? But it's out there. The research is very clear. And again, there's more on my website about this. Number 3 bullet is never stop moving. I might share at the very end just the really unique design of our entire cosmos, entire world, and how it pertains to movement. But all I can say right here is that a good body of evidence indicates that adhering to a regular exercise regimen, I really don't even like the word exercise, it's just a regular regimen of movement, whatever way you can get your movement, can be as effective in treating mild to moderate depression as medication and therapy. And that's just one example of a benefit. So we're saying that as our world is becoming more sedentary, we are designed to move, even in small little ways, even if you have a disability that prevents a lot of movement except in very simple ways. We are designed to move in order for our health and well-being. And so it's a fascinating area. I'm not sure if I presented that talk years ago, but I have a talk that really kind of dives into this. And it's something that I think when we become more curious about, we're amazed at the potential. Number 4 is do for the others as thyself and experience the gifts of volunteering. So again, we'll talk more about this in this talk, but volunteering has as many benefits or more for the person who volunteers than also compared to the person who's receiving those gifts. Number 5 is time to head back to the woods. And this is really, really cool. There's just more and more scientific evidence that being in nature in almost all conditions, even the cold, even the gloomy, has enhanced benefits that we can't get indoors. One of the neatest findings is that the colors that you find, those green colors that are embedded within our natural world, seem to have specific mood enhancing effects that you can't find indoors. And so I really think this has all been programmed into our world here, right? But it's a pretty fascinating area. And then the second to last one, free our bedroom and our sleep. So the relationship between sleep and anxiety is one of the most robust in the psychological research. Most people who have sleep difficulties or struggle in that way also struggle with anxiety concerns and vice versa. So we live in a world that doesn't really prioritize sleep in regards to our habits and our environment, but it's something that we really have to pursue, I think, if we're going to be healthy. And finally, pursue the path of silence. This is near and dear to my heart, probably because I'm a dad of 8 kids, I don't know. But the idea of regular silence is actually very life-giving, even if it's scary to a lot of people. And the science behind it's pretty fascinating because we see that regular periods of silence, even for just a few minutes a day, are associated with improved creativity, better memory, decreased blood pressure, improved sleep patterns, and less risk of depression. So in a world that's anything but silent, silence remains still an important thing to pursue. So engaging these habits allows us to pursue deeper realities that affect our health and well-being, in addition to being mechanisms of health and well-being themselves. In essence, I would argue they set the stage for movement in a direction of hope and joy, not inertia and despair. And I want to just add again one last thing about those 7 areas. No matter where you are on all of those areas, let's say again, you haven't been outdoors to a trail in 10 years. Let's say again, you have a 100% processed diet, or let's say you haven't, done any kind of movement in over a decade. The beauty of those areas is it doesn't really matter where you're at. That's your starting point. And we don't want to compare ourselves to other people because I think it often demoralizes us. But we just want to say, here's where I'm at. Let's be honest about it. And any tiny step we can go in a positive direction is a life-giving step. It really increases our capacity. And so I think that people can get overwhelmed and discouraged because they look at others and they think, well, they're way past where I am, or the advice given seems impossible. And unfortunately, that isn't really where we should be. We should just be where we're at right now, and we should think of the easiest step we can take to move in a positive direction. So that set the stage, and we're going to dive into our 5 necessary steps to turn distress into joy. I'm really excited about sharing this with you today. Again, I think you'll find some newness and things that you might have thought you knew before. And we definitely want to encourage different points of conversation. I encourage you to send through the chat all throughout the day, or I should say the morning, any questions or ideas that you've got, and we'll kind of track that. But I'll also have some times where we'll open up the mic too and just allow you to ask questions there. So we're going to dive in. So number 1 is forgiveness. And I love this quote from C.S. Lewis, quote, "Forgiving does not mean excusing. Many people seem to think it does. They think that if you ask them to forgive someone who has cheated or bullied them, you are trying to make it out that there was no real cheating or no bullying. But if that were so, there would be nothing to forgive. But what it does mean is that you must make every effort, and the key here is the effort, right? To kill every taste of resentment in your own heart, every wish to humiliate or hurt him or to pay him out." So I'm going to have a couple chat questions that I'm going to put up and actually minimize my screen a little bit to kind of follow your responses. Here is my first question for the chat. And I know that you don't have time to respond in full maybe, but why do you think it can be so hard to forgive others? I'd love to hear your thoughts. What off the cuff do you think, why is forgiveness such a hard thing to do? I see pride. Because we don't think they're remorseful. We feel like we've been betrayed. because you're still hurting. These are great answers. Ego, it's hard to let go of your own hurt. The intrinsic pain. I think, it's interesting as I'm looking at these responses, and I really, really appreciate your interaction around this. It is hard to let go of pain, right? There's something in psychology we call filtering. Filtering is a cognitive distortion that some of you are familiar with. And filtering is this idea, like, I want you to take the visual of a swimming pool, right? You've got this beautiful pool. It's June 30th. We've got all the sun in the world, right? And you dive into this gorgeous pool. And somewhere in that pool, though, there is a filter, right? There is a filter that gets a hold of the leaves and the frogs and everything else like that. And it traps that for good reason. And what that filter does, of course, is it allows that clean water to flow through, but it keeps a hold of the refuge, right? Well, in some ways, I think this is what we do. This is what happens with our pain, right? And it's very, very normal human experiences. We stay in that filter, right? We can't, we see the negative things and we hold on to them and they remain in there. And meanwhile, there's tons of source of clear goodness all around us, right? But we just can't get out of the filter. And I think that's, when we get stuck there, the pain is very real. And I think that it's just, we can't get outside the pain to see the goodness that surrounds us. And so these are some great responses. I see someone saying, accepting that someone will change. I can only forgive if I think the person won't repeat that. And that's a tough one, right? Because you don't know that person's not going to repeat that offense. You don't know that that's not going to happen again. And so every time that we forgive, I think one of the things that makes it so hard is we're kind of putting ourselves in a vulnerable state, right? We're reaching outside of ourselves to say, I don't even feel it. And by the way, there's a difference we'll talk about between emotional forgiveness and decisional forgiveness. I don't even feel it. And even if I felt it, I'm not sure I can trust you that it's not going to happen again here, right? So when we dive into this, one of the first things we have to do with all of these elements is we have to ask ourselves, what are the obstacles that are preventing me from moving to where I want to move, right? And if we're not honest about the obstacles, we're not going to go anywhere. The worst thing we can do in this world that I'm talking about here is to minimize something that's actually rather large, right? I think the biggest lie, and I'm going to be hard on our male species here for a second, the biggest lie that men tell is, quote, it's not a big deal. Now, you know what? It probably actually is a big deal. No skin off my back, right? Not a big deal. No big deal. Actually, it probably is. And I think when we minimize something like that, we really minimize our opportunities for growth, right? We just don't see how it's a big deal, but it really is. So thank you so much. These are just wonderful responses in the chat. I'm going to dive off the chat for a second and dive back in here. Okay. So I want to start off with just an incredible tale of forgiveness. And, hopefully this provides a little bit of inspiration, even if you could never imagine the things I'll share today. But on the night of January 21st, 1995, Azim Khamisa's life changed forever. While delivering pizza, his 20-year-old son, Tariq Khamisa, was shot and killed by Tony Hicks, a 14-year-old gang member. Set to be married to his girlfriend, Tariq would never see his wedding day, neither would his father. But what happens next is nothing short of miraculous. Okay, I want to stop there for a second. I can't imagine being, first of all, in Azim's place. As a father, the absolute rage and just confusion and everything that I would feel would be overwhelming. And so when you put yourself in that place, you think, oh my gosh, how is that possible? But what happens next is something that is, again, something that gives us all hope in our own lives to forgive. As described in a CBS interview, Azim felt that he needed to take some responsibility for the tragic death of his own son, which I can't imagine how you begin that. But he started by forgiving Tony Hicks' family and eventually forged a friendship with his guardian and grandfather, Ples Felix. He then founded the Tariq Khamisa Foundation in honor of his son with the purpose of reducing youth violence by reaching students at various ages. Founded on 6 tenets, the foundation, which provides services and mentorship to over 20,000 students annually, begins with the idea that, quote, violence is real and hurts us all, and ends with a belief from conflict, love and unity are possible. I think it's one of the most beautiful phrases I could ever imagine. That's so beautiful. But Azim's story does not end there. 5 years after his son's life was ended by an arbitrary bullet, Azim stared into the eyes of his murderer. He saw himself. Then he forgave Tony, and he offered him a job at the foundation if and when he would be released from prison. Tony is up for parole in actually 3 years. And I sure hope that continues on and he sees him and that job continues. But it's really, it's a story that I can't imagine any of us being there, and I can't imagine the process that he had to go through. But I think it inspires us to consider that even in the worst situations, forgiveness is possible. And the thing that, that Azim talks about in this interview is it's not like he doesn't feel moments still to this day of rage or anger or sadness. He does, but he is super intentional about the recognition that not just for others, but really for himself, he realized I needed to forgive. Otherwise, I was going to implode and it was going to get nobody nowhere at all. And so I think that's a really big key with forgiveness is don't necessarily think, oh, well, I can just erase all the negative emotion. We love that. And if it happens, I really think that's wonderful. But the key is what we're going to talk about is being very intentional with our forgiveness here. So why forgive? Some of us may be asking, yeah, I hear you saying this is probably a good thing, but honestly, really, I'm not sure that you're in my place, nor do you understand me. Well, for starters, there's 3,000 plus scientific citations that largely indicate that forgiving results in greater physical, psychological health, including less anxiety, depression, and perceived stress. And this only speaks to the potential benefits for the person doing the forgiving. So I don't think any of us out there would say, I want more anxiety, or I don't want any, I don't want less negative mood, right? Or I love when there's tons of stress. So if forgiveness allows us to go into, areas and to improve our physical and psychological and social and spiritual well-being, well, maybe we should consider it. Maybe it's something that even if we don't feel like it, it's worth pursuing. But I want to talk about some keys. These are some things you probably haven't thought about, or most of you haven't thought about around what we call effective forgiveness. The first, and this is really, really important, is the difference between an intrapersonal process versus an interpersonal process. So I think a lot of people, when you hear the word forgiveness, they actually instantly think of reconciliation. They see forgiveness, or we see forgiveness as I have to reconcile with that person or who, the transgression came from. But the reality actually of forgiveness is that is not necessarily synonymous. While, in some situations, it's great to reconcile, the key to forgiveness is actually the inner process. And there may be situations where, for different reasons, you may never reconcile with the perpetrator, or you may never, go through and attempt to reach out in reconciliation. But forgiveness is always has to be intrapersonally, you making that decision to go forward to forgive that person or those people. And so that's a key that we often forget. We think that reconciliation and forgiveness are the same thing, but they aren't necessarily the same thing. The second thing is that we really want to strive towards interpersonal reconciliation sentiment. Now, here's the sentiment idea. Again, we may not reconcile directly with a person, but we're striving to kind of come to some internal reconciliation with ourselves and have some level of positive sentiment. And I use the example of the Rwandan genocide here because I think it is the most powerful example I can think of, which is imagine that, you were part of that genocide and you watched family members murdered. And then after the genocide was over, that your family members were gone, and you would go to the public square and you would see the person that killed, your brother or your mother or whoever, and you had no choice but in many ways walk by them every day in order to keep your life going and what you needed to. What we found was that at a certain level, you may have to reconcile because it's just simply what you have to do, right? It's necessary for your own ability to go forward and to kind of move on. And so that's that idea of interpersonal reconciliation sentiment. At some level, we have to have a sentiment that says, I just, I may not always feel like this, but I have to kind of go forward in pursuing that. And we also need to see forgiveness in that last bullet as a mechanism for accepting and even embracing a different life than the one desired. I go back to that example with Mr. Kamisa, and I think, the life he desired was to see his son grow up, get married, and have his own kids and have grandkids, but that life was no longer possible after his son was killed. So part of forgiveness is accepting that I might have to not only accept, but even embrace a different life than I desired, which is really hard for us, right? As human beings, we want what we want. And we have to make sure that negative emotion is not the primary decision maker. So When it comes to forgiveness, we have to start with these 3 keys. Otherwise, we're not going to get off the ground floor in using it effectively. And so there's mechanisms here, and I'm going to take you through some really specific mechanisms that I really encourage you. You can go online and find this research. You can find actually a workbook that you can go through yourself for free. But research is uncovering specific mechanisms that are very powerful in this area. And one of the models is called the REACH model, developed by Dr. Everett Worthington at Virginia Commonwealth. And again, it's available online. It's been heavily researched. Really sadly for Dr. Worthington, he himself was faced with the challenging task of forgiveness when his 76-year-old mother was brutally murdered by someone who burglarized her home. And he talks about this too. But I want to take you through a few examples in just the REACH model itself, and for you to kind of see how this can be a really powerful tool to use. So the REACH model is R is recall the hurt, E is empathize with the one who hurt you, A is give an altruistic gift of forgiveness, C is commit to the forgiveness you experienced, and H is hold on to the forgiveness when you doubt. And what he makes a repeated distinction between, I think this is a really big key, is the difference between decisional forgiveness and emotional forgiveness. So decisional forgiveness involves committing to treating the transgressor with less negativity and greater value. Benefits include that, one, if we are ever going to feel emotionally like we can forgive someone, it's the gateway to this. We can't get into emotional forgiveness without decisional forgiveness. It's really kind of impossible. 2, if we ever desire relationship repair, whether it's with our spouse or a friend or whatever, this is really the first step to that. And 3, it's really improves the ethical and spiritual status of who we are in many ways, right? We become the forgiver and we see ourselves in a more positive light than someone maybe who is holding grudges. And it's actually important that we see ourselves that way. Emotional forgiveness is associated with the feeling of forgiveness with the transgressor. And when we get there, we see that emotional forgiveness is most linked with improved physical health. So improved GI features, our immune system, cardiovascular functioning. Again, all of these overlay with the physical side. And it just improves, other areas of psychological functioning. So less rumination, anger, PTSD symptoms, depression, and so on. But again, let's talk about, we think about the difference between decisional, which is the first step, and emotional forgiveness, which comes later for most people. All right, so I'm going to take you through the REACH model a little bit, and I'm actually going to use an example of something that happened in my own life. This is about 20 years ago that at the time was really difficult for me. And I really encourage you guys to check out the workbook and think of a specific instance in your own life that you can kind of go through this. And so I've just taken specific strategies from each element, but there are more strategies and ideas that each element has that are worth kind of checking out. So number 1 is recall the hurt, right? And this is a quote again from Worthington. We aren't going to get anywhere if we keep telling the same story repeatedly. We need another more objective yet still true story. So one of the strategies he describes is called giving the hurt away. And this is that we rewrite the story from the perspective of someone other than yourself and also not the transgressor. And in essence, we are the fly on the wall in the room of where all this has occurred. And we focus on utilizing a vantage point that does not focus on the experience of being the victim or on how bad the perpetrator is or the negative consequences, but we step back and say, what's a perspective that gives us maybe more of an objective feel? So here's the example I'm going to use. When I finished up my graduate school internship, I went into a postdoc program. It was a program actually in a department that I knew well. It was a great place, and it remains great training for me and really a lot of ways. But when I went into that program, kind of implicitly, I had been promised that if you do a decent job and we know who you are, there'll be a position waiting for you. Well, after a few months, and one of my supervisors left, who was kind of the key over the autism program at that time, and left to take another position, I kind of started noticing that things seemed to be unraveling a little bit. And by the end of my postdoc year, it was agreed that instead of me just kind of readily assuming a position, I was going to stay on for another 3 to 4 months as kind of a probationary period to decide whether or not this was the place to be, both for me and for the department head. Well, anyway, after the 3 months came to be, it was decided by the department head that he really felt like that it was a best fit for me to move on and look for another position, which I was, again, fortunate to land one soon after. But it really, for me at that point, was not the place to stay, given the skills and given everything that I had. And I remember it being very honest and vulnerable with all of you on this call. I went home weeping that night to my wife, and I just had this in my mind. I saw my pathway, and that was the only way I could see me being happy with how my professional career was going to start. And so it hit me hard. And I saw it as very much a failure. And so I struggled with that for quite a while. But when I step back and I think about this idea of recall the hurt and this giving the hurt away, and I step back now, and it's of course easier many years later, and I really see the wisdom of a lot of things. And I take not the view of just myself, but also, and not my department head, but someone outside of that. I recognize that in many ways there was great wisdom in what he was doing, which is that he gave me time to think about it more, and then ultimately said, hey, look, we know that you have a lot of great skills and a lot of areas that you can contribute. We just don't think that this is actually the place to do it. And I, at the time, was so committed to that route, I couldn't see it. I could just see how angry I was, that I felt like I was kind of, being betrayed. It's a strong word, but maybe that's how I felt. And so, and now that I look at it more objectively, I think, it wasn't the right place for me at that time. It was a great place to be trained in, but it wasn't the right place. And so that's an example of trying to give the hurt away, of taking a different perspective, that I think is particularly powerful there. The second element is empathize with the one who hurt you. So again, Worthington says, we all do things for what we believe at the time to be good reasons, but they might not seem like good reasons to the people who have been hurt. Because we've all had this experience of hurting others, even with the best of intentions, we can understand that the person who hurt us, using this target transgression, probably had what he or she believed to be good reasons. So back to my example, the exercise I use here, E1, this exercise focuses on understanding the reasons why we hurt someone in the past, how we justified it, and how the other person might have perceived it differently. And so I thought about, my life, like, okay, I've done some things too where I thought like that was the right thing to say, right? I can remember things in high school where I said some things to my friends. I thought, well, they deserved it. And then looking back, I think, well, just because I thought they deserved it doesn't mean it was completely truly justified, even though I did it in my mind. And, I start to kind of empathize with the one that hurt you. And just like I was describing the example during my training, I empathize with the situation that my department head was in. He had a tough position, and I knew that he didn't like that. And so when I use this idea here, I look back and I think his intention was not to hurt me. It was to really do what was best there for me. So I think this idea of empathizing with one who hurt you is a powerful, even if not difficult, stretch or element to use. Number 3, give an altruistic gift of forgiveness. This is an incredible thing to think about, but I think the visual, and I'm a very visual person, is really powerful to consider. And so Worthington says, in thinking about how you felt when you were forgiven and how good it feels to simply do something altruistic that a person does not deserve, wouldn't you like to forgive, emotionally even, the person who hurt you? So this is really looking at forgiveness as a gift, right? And, A2 kind of talks about the questions and reflections are posed and I'll talk about this following story, which is chilling for sure. But imagine you were to give someone a gift, right? And imagine the gift didn't have so much to do with the other person, but that you simply felt like, I want to give this gift, even if I don't necessarily feel like giving this gift. And in doing so, this intrapersonal process, I feel good about doing it, right? I feel like I'm doing something that's maybe ethical and noble and important, and I'm just going to give this gift, even though it's really hard. That's what Worthington's going after here, is that it's really key is it's altruistic. You want things in return, but you're not expecting it, right? And I think all of us who've given gifts over the years of all kinds recognize that there is something very meaningful about giving a gift, especially when it's difficult, right? And that's what he's asking us to do here. And so he used this story, and I apologize if I mispronounce these names, but it's an incredible story about Yehiel Denur, who was a Holocaust survivor, who was a witness during the trial of the infamous Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann. Denur entered the courtroom and stared at the man who, behind the bulletproof glass, the man who had presided over the slaughter of millions of people. The court was hushed as the victim confronted a butcher of his people, and suddenly Denur began to sob and collapsed to the floor. but not out of anger or bitterness. As he explained later in an interview, what struck him was a terrifying realization. Quote, "I was afraid about myself," Denier said. Quote, "I saw that I was capable to do this exactly like he." In a moment of chilling clarity, Denier saw the skull beneath the skin. Eichmann, he concluded, is in all of us. And I've read that a number of times over the years. I've written about this. Every time I read that, it's both uncomfortable, it's chilling, but I think it also cuts through me. And it reminds me that even when we would like to believe we would never do the worst thing, we are all human beings capable of some pretty awful things. And so before we decide we would never give the gift of forgiveness, maybe, again, that gift isn't so much about the other person, but what we're being called to do ourselves. Number 4, commit to the forgiveness you experienced. Worthington says you can move through the reach forgiveness steps once, and it probably won't erase our bad feelings about the transgression, but it will lighten them. And through repeated washings, we become free of the negative, unforgiving feelings. So this is really the idea. It's a commitment, right? It's not necessarily something that's just going to launch and be fine and we're good. It's a true commitment. And in the third exercise here, he says, what if emotional forgiveness isn't complete? And it focuses on experiences or exercises related to the feelings of partial or limited forgiveness, and also situations where the transgressor committed multiple acts against you, and how you don't need to forgive every hurtful act individually to still have forgiven the person. I remembered in the example that I gave you at the beginning that even after I got further removed away and I started my new position, by the way, in a department that was really a great fit for me, and that went on and I grew, there were still times I was just kind of finding myself, again, whether I was feeling like a failure or just feeling as if I didn't want to let go of that hurt or that sense of bitterness, it would come back to me. But as Worthington said here, over time, I realized that is just normal. It's just part of what we do. And the key is, from a decisional standpoint, that we have to commit to the forgiveness, even if we always don't feel like it. And number 5, hold on forgiveness when you doubt. Quote, you have a choice about your emotions. You can hold on to your unforgiving emotions, or if you've replaced those with love or empathy or sympathy or compassion, you can now hold on to your emotional forgiveness, even in the face of powerful events that demand that you give up that emotional forgiveness. I think about this, again, in a visual way. It's like sometimes we try to hold on to the clouds, or we grasp for the clouds, and the clouds might be our anger and our bitterness, and we realize I can't get a hold of those, right? It's not possible. But in the opposite way here, we want to hold on to something that we can hold, that we can retain. And so the clouds are kind of like our emotions. They're difficult to hold on to. They're difficult to do things with sometimes. But the decisions and the intentionality and everything that we make is really, really powerful. And I think one of my favorite quotes of all time actually comes from the Holocaust. And some of you know this, but Viktor Frankl, who lost many of his family in the Holocaust, once said, the last of the human freedoms is to choose one's own attitude in any given set of circumstances. And I always thought that if he could kind of intentionally say, I can choose my perspective, my attitude, I can hold on to forgiveness, even in those circumstances, it certainly gives us hope in many ways that we can all do this, right? So those are the 5 elements. Those are examples of some of the strategies that are in place, but you really have to go into kind of the workbook and go into what he does to get the full sense and the full richness of that. But I think that there's so much available for us in this world of forgiveness. And I love the opportunities that, again, it costs nothing at all. All right, so what we're going to do here is we're going to go through, I think, the second movement. And then we're going to take a quick break so that we kind of all, hopefully you're not falling asleep or whatever. We're going to take 5 minutes at the end of this second one here, and we'll come back and continue on there. So movement number 2 is channeling. And this quote from Shane Niemeyer, quote, a fine line separates our angels from our demons. And so Shane Niemeyer, this is an incredible tale, but it began in a really awful way. And it began where he tried to kill himself. He had tried to hang himself, and it too had failed. Like much of his life to that point, which had been spent in and out of state custody since his adolescent years, his road had hit a dead end. But in the depths of his despair, thoughts of a different kind surfaced with one idea in mind: Iron Man. Sitting in his straitjacket, awaiting sentencing as a homeless heroin addict, he he had turned the pages of an endurance magazine to pass the time. As he began to read more about triathlons, there was something about the discipline, the drive, the pursuit of a difficult goal, which began to consume him. The thought entered his mind, maybe he could be one of them. Maybe his life could change forever. Again, what happens next is nothing short of miraculous. So what happens, and there's a full story, you gotta check Shane out online, is he eventually gets out of prison and he starts training. And within, I think it was less than maybe, I don't know, a year, he does his first half Ironman. And having done an Ironman myself years ago in Louisville, I certainly understand all the rigors of the training here and everything else. But his half Ironman time is really pretty extraordinary. And I think within a year or two, he does a full Ironman. And the next thing you know, he becomes a training coach. And he really gets into the sport at a very, very high level. And this was a guy who, again, almost wasn't alive, who was sitting in a straitjacket, who had gone through repeated stints in prison, who looked at his life and transformed, again, using the drives that cost him so greatly. He then found a way to channel them in a way that really exceeded what we could ever imagine here. So it's an amazing story. The idea is, why do we channel? Well, whether it's because it's bred of genetic underpinnings or individual experiences or immediate surroundings or collective culture, whatever influences, we all have a unique energy that begins to manifest itself early in our lives. We express it as desires or urges or compulsions or curiosities or drives or interests or any other given name. This energy gradually becomes known as part of our personality. But in actuality, it's a dynamic daily interplay of what I will simply call drives for the ease of communication. It's an ever-evolving, unique sense of self that interfaces with the world in which we live. What we do with it becomes of ultimate importance, especially when it can cause distress. And that's what Shane Niemeyer found out. The very same thing that led him to be a drug addict also could lead him to be an elite endurance athlete, but he had to channel it in the appropriate way. He had to really know what to do with it. And the research involving channeling, which, by the way, this is a really new area that's, I think, cutting edge, and I really encourage you to check more out, has found some really great things about this. So here's a couple of studies in the areas I think that we're all interested in. One, a study of professionals indicated that those who showed the greatest transformation from the negative emotions at the beginning of the day, so let's say your day started out horrible, you're like, oh, woke up on the wrong side of the bed, I can't find anything I wanted, I had a flat tire at work. But they showed the greatest transformation to negative at the beginning to positive at the end, right? Somehow they channeled that energy in a positive way, also ended up having the greatest creative output. So negative emotion isn't necessarily bad if we use it well, right? Here's another one that's neat. For all you pessimists out there, pessimism associated with anxiety, they can be channeled into strategic discernment of critical variables, can lead to as effective actions when compared to strategic optimists. What we mean here is if you can kind of understand, maybe I'm not pessimistic about the whole situation. Maybe there are certain variables that I just am wary about that I don't think are great. And if I can really be more strategic about understanding those, then I actually can then use that effectively as a tool and information to figure out better solutions, even more than maybe the optimists out there that think everything seems rose-colored. So there's, again, really neat research about how we can channel pessimism into what I would call productivity. A third area, envy can be effectively used for goal achievement. If this initial feeling leads an individual to better understand just exactly what it is that another individual has that's desired, right? So when I look at somebody and I'm envious, I need to ask myself, what is it that I am envious about, right? Like what specific elements? Because we might think it's the whole person, but what you'll find out, it's not the whole person. It's usually just a few key elements, right? Is it their fitness? Is it their popularity in certain areas? And then when we understand that better and what we're envious about, we can begin to channel, discern, and kind of compel action steps needed to accomplish these particular goals. But again, the mistake we often make is that maybe we just look at somebody and like they've got everything going together. Well, they probably don't. And actually, if you're more judicious about thinking it through, you might find there's specific elements that we can pursue more closely. Fourth area, significant loss can be a conduit to long-term positive feelings of gratitude about so many aspects of life not previously considered. This happens over and over. People experience horrible tragedies, which no one wants, but then they find that they are so much more grateful later in life about things they took for granted than they were before the tragedy. And the last one here I've got listed is negative emotions, specifically anger, that is fear-based, can be effectively channeled in effective solutions for individuals and companies, even when mechanisms are used to more effectively identify the source of their anger and the ways in which specific strategies can lead to better communication. So I go all the way back towards the beginning. I said to you, all emotions are either one of two things, right? Messengers or informants. If we look at those emotions and ask ourselves, what is it telling me, or what am I trying to tell someone else? It's amazing. You can begin to channel things in much more productive way. So ideas for channeling. Maybe stress gets channeled into a run. Maybe your worry gets morphed into cleaning. My wife would actually like that about me if that happened, but I haven't quite figured that one out yet. So maybe anger gets sublimated into mindfulness exercises. Sadness becomes a journal entry. Mowing the yard might be harnessing of some edginess that you feel from a tough interaction. Doing the dishes might be channeling frustration about seemingly an ineffective day. Now, I can do the dishes okay, so I feel like maybe that's where I go. But every day, whether we know it or not, we are channeling and sublimating, that's a little bit more of a psychoanalytic word, on a regular basis. But when our drives and energy are not channeled effectively, and this is a really big key, it leads to all sorts of destructive habits, whether it's substance abuse, pornography addiction. Have you ever noticed that? If I don't do something with this energy, if I don't do something with this emotion, it's going to probably lead me into places I don't want to go. I don't want to be going there. I don't want to be tempted there, but I can't just say, turn it off. And we can't tell our kids, just stop it. Don't do it. I mean, we can tell them that, but I'm going to tell you over and over as a parent myself, it's probably one of the least effective things that we do. Better to say, hey, if you're feeling this, hey, that's probably not the appropriate way to act on it, but here's some other ideas for you that I think are better. So in essence, the incredible potential for self-control is likely not even possible without effective channeling. And this has been interesting. The research has found that it's really not self-control. We all desire it and we all need it, but it's actually not controlling yourself. It's allocating yourself in different ways. That's actually what we've seen is truly what we consider self-control. So right before our break, I want to ask you this as a kind of minimize and go out. What is your favorite way to channel negative energy into something positive? I would love to see ideas on the chat. How do you take something that feels negative and use it productively beyond maybe the ideas I offered there? Motivation to work out, right? I mean, seriously, negative emotions are great motivation. High intensity interval training. Adult coloring. I love that. It's become really popular these days. I think it's so cool. Art, writing, walking briskly, listening to music, yoga, knitting. I'd love to be able to knit. I've watched my mom do that for years, and I really need to talk to her more. Watching Law and Order and knowing my issue isn't that bad. I love that. I love those ideas. Kickboxing. You know the beautiful thing about this, as we get ready to go to break, and I look at your great ideas, is there's an infinite number of ways we can channel, right? This is not a finite relationship. We don't get to number 100 and go, well, that's it. We're done with our channeling ideas. There is truly an infinite number of ways that we as human beings are still exploring and still coming to understand that we can channel. And honestly, some of it might never involve even leaving the room that you're in. And I know that's even a little bit more mysterious, but because I encourage a lot of movement with this, but it's really, really amazing. So, all right, on my watch, it's maybe a little ahead, but I have 11:03. We're going to come back at 11:08 and we're going to continue from there. So thanks so much for all of your time and attention. as everyone's coming back on and we get ready to start again, I was thinking about, we were talking about the ideas of channeling, and my mom has a friend that's been one of her best friends for years and years. And Barb often goes walking. I know that she channels her stress into walking. And over the years, her husband actually is a really amazing artist. He's made, different clay pots and everything and sold them internationally, and has done a lot of teaching. And she started to collect trash along the roadway and actually turned it into some amazing artwork. She had an art show locally here at the Evansville Museum. And I thought, what a neat way. Here she's out taking a walk, getting exercise. She's picking up random things that she finds and then turning it into artwork. She's not only cleaning up the world and being in movement, but she's being creative in the process. And so I really hold to the idea that there is no finite limit on how we channel. It's all out there for us if we want it, right? So, all right, we're going to go forward. We're back at 11:09, and let's begin. Okay, so number 3 of our movements, helping others. I love this quote by Charles Dickens. No one is useless in this world who lightens the burdens of another. So I'm going to begin by an incredible tale like I've been doing for the other 2. And this starts very, very sad. And this is close to home with someone that I know really well. Kate Bergenschmidt was an energetic, driven, and kind-hearted 11-year-old who impacted all who had the privilege of knowing and loving her. But on July 26, 2015, Kate's Bomb Squad 4 team won a softball game early in the morning, and Kate and some of her teammates went on to one of their houses to hang out between games. Tragically, Kate died in an ATV accident. With one phone call on one ordinary day to her parents who were not there, life as we knew it changed forever. Again, I can only imagine myself in the situation, and Ashley and the parents experiencing this. Kate had never even been on an ATV before, and it was just something they didn't even know was going on. And here it seemed like a typical day, and everything changed forever. And so what do you do with that, right? What do you do? In many ways, actually, what you do is, you obviously just trying to absorb all that's occurred. But over time, back to the idea of channeling, you begin to channel it into many things that you think are life-giving when you saw that life removed. But I want to give you a sense of what Kate's legacy has been. And by the way, this is a story here that's based just outside of Evansville. The Bergenschmidts live in Newburgh, which is just a few minutes from here. And since Kate's accidents, the Bergenschmidts have done the following and much more to help others. They built playground, actually that's one playground, but multiple playgrounds for kids at the softball fields where Kate used to play. They became the driving force behind HEA 1200, which was a new helmet law for kids in the state of Indiana, mandating that kids 17 and under must wear helmets when riding an ATV on both public and private ground. To my knowledge, since the passing of this bill, now I think it's definitely been longer since I first did this, but there hadn't been a single child in that first year and a half since it had passed. They built the first ever, work with other people, the first ever ATV safety robots to educate kids, parents, and communities about ATV safety. And now we have even more than 4 of those in the state of Indiana, and they're currently building more for other states. They've purchased wrapped ATV safety trailers for the state of Indiana to help spread the safety message, create an ATV safety coloring app, spoken at national conferences, and so much more. And so what do you do when the worst happens, right? Well, in some ways, you channel it into giving to others. And that's what the Bergenschmidts have done. And that's what Kate's legacy is all about. And this line from Ashley, this is straight from her. It's just one of the most powerful lines I think you'll ever read. She said, quote, "You have to make your heart bigger than the hole that was left after the tragedy. You have to make decisions out of love. You can't look at life and think, I have nothing left to give because of our tragedy. How we deal with death is at least as important as how we deal with life. What we do on earth matters. It sets our course for eternity. Empower people, offer hope, try to bring meaning to the pain. That is how I continue to survive." Every time I read that, it just, as a parent, as a person, it really moves me almost to the point of tears. But helping others has been so much of what has helped the Bergenschmidts find joy again. And so why helping others helps ourselves? Well, it's interesting. Research has repeatedly indicated that helping others is associated with improved physical health and psychological well-being, like our other elements. And it's associated with increased pro-social behaviors, life satisfaction, improved mood, and decreased risk-taking. And evidence suggests that this relationship is particularly strong later in life. It's really interesting. For those of you, as you get older and older, we find that volunteering is even more important in some ways the older you get. And so that's something to think about if you're in retirement age or you're kind of working with those at that level. It's particularly meaningful. Findings related to the positive impact of volunteering and helping others is generally associated with low to moderate levels of volunteering, meaning you can't overdo it. So this is something to note that be careful, like don't overdo it so much that you get burnt out and you're not, getting the benefits from it. But mild to moderate levels of volunteering typically are really good. And it appears that levels of empathy as a precursor is a strong predictor for an individual's level of altruism. Let's say that, again, you have to really kind of put yourself in other people's places before you're probably going to do altruistic acts. So if you struggle with that, and by the way, empathy is something that can be developed across the lifespan, you really have to kind of take some exercises and means of kind of pursuing a greater sense of how other people might experience life so that you can initiate more of a sense of volunteering. But a couple of the keys I want to talk about with volunteering that really come down to why it's so effective is the difference between eudaimonic versus hedonic well-being, okay? So the first is eudaimonic well-being is actually feeling good about ourselves in contrast to just feeling good. So I always give this example with this talk. Eating a Blizzard from Dairy Queen feels great. And sometimes it's the perfect thing at the perfect moment. And you're like, hey, we got to go for it, right? Nothing wrong with that. But eating a Blizzard just feels good, right? I don't know that many people would say it makes me feel good about myself, but it sure feels good eating it, right? Especially chocolate cookie dough. But when I help someone else, it might not only, maybe it's even hard in the moment, but not only maybe does it feel good in some ways, but I feel better about myself for doing it. And that's the eudaimonic well-being. And what we find is you want to have both in life. But if you don't have enough eudaimonic well-being and sources of that, you're going to struggle to be as happy as you would probably want to be. And so that's one key that really allows volunteering to kind of be so impactful. The second concept, this was way back in the early 80s that was kind of identified as part of volunteering or helping others, is the sense of mattering, right? When we do something for someone else, we feel that we matter to them, right? I mean, it's as simple as that. When I help somebody else out in a difficult time, I feel as if what I've given is this, that, I matter to them because I've helped them in a certain way. And I think the third thing is that it brings us into communion with others, even when we don't feel in communion with ourselves and particular people, right? How many times have you had in your life where you wanted to feel better about your relationship with maybe your son or your daughter, your spouse, your significant other, but you weren't there at the time, right? You wanted to be closer with them, but you couldn't be, right? And what we find is that in those situations, when we go out and say, hey, I can't be as close with these people as I want, but I can give of myself to others in a way that's meaningful, that matters, it actually brings us in more in communion with people in general, right? So we might desire someone in our lives that isn't really open to the same way that we desire them. But if we give ourselves to others in genuine ways, we overall find a greater sense of communion with people. And that's a really powerful thing. So my question for the chat is, what volunteer activity has stuck the most with you in your life and even altered your perspective in meaningful ways? And I'm going to tell a little bit of story as you guys think about it. What really have you done in your life that you thought, that stayed with me for a long time and it changed my perspective? When I was younger, we used to have what we call the Christmas families through our church. And back in that day, you wouldn't just kind of get together the gifts for those families, but you would actually go into the home and you would deliver those gifts. And that's changed over time in some ways. And I mean, I understand maybe even related to different concerns, but for a young kid, for me, it was particularly meaningful walking into other people's homes and getting a sense of how they lived and the environment by which they lived that I would not have been afforded had I not, been in those places. And I just kind of started to find, it made me think differently. It made me, well, to be honest, in some ways, it made me more grateful for certain areas, but it also made me just more aware of the ways that people live. So on the chat line here, can you think of particular, and maybe just briefly, a volunteer experience that has stuck with you, that's been meaningful in your life? What are your thoughts? Let's see here. So volunteer there as a candy striper, being Casa, which is an amazing thing. Volunteers for Special Olympics. I love that. We have our Challenger Leagues right down the road. It's just such a joyful place to be, isn't it? Random notes of kindness to coworkers. That is something that we can all do, and I think it's such a life-giving thing. You can send a quick email and say, hey, by the way, I've been thinking about you, and congrats. This morning I sent an email to some colleagues across town who are growing a program. Just because I thought it's really neat that they're growing this program and they're putting a lot of effort into it, and it felt good to do that, right? Helping at the food bank, equine therapy, tutoring a child, being again a Red Cross volunteer. Thank you guys so much for being on the chat this morning. You guys are amazing, just amazing. Helping at the food bank, animal shelter. I love these things, right? And isn't it great that in helping other people, we can help ourselves? What an amazing design. That's a beautiful design. I mean, I can't think of something more life-giving to think I can give to somebody else and I get something in return. That's it. That's all I need to know, right? That's beautiful. So thank you guys for all these wonderful responses. All right, so next up, movement number 4, gratitude. True gratefulness rejoices in the other, says Robert Emmons and Robin Stern. Its ultimate goal is to reflect back the goodness that one has received by creatively seeking opportunities for giving. The motivation for doing so resides in the grateful appreciation that one has lived by the grace of others. In this sense, the spirituality of gratitude is opposed to the self-serving belief that one deserves or is entitled to the blessings that he or she enjoys. It's a real powerful statement on gratitude. I want to highlight 2 key phrases there. One is that the appreciation that one has lived by the grace of others. Even if you're out there and you have had a really difficult life with a lot of difficult people, at some point in your life with certain people, in some ways, you have only resided, you have only lived, you have only operated by the grace of others, right? I think that's hard to sometimes feel that way, but it's kind of a reality. Like, we don't live alone. When I'm a little infant, I require something to get me to the stage of toddlerhood. When I'm a toddler, I require, other things to get me beyond that. And here in my work, even in this wonderful department, right? Like all these different areas, like I require so many people to allow for us all to do the things that we do, right? The other thing is that I love that the spirituality of gratitude is opposed to a self-serving belief. You know, the other thing it's opposed to? In the moment of being grateful, like literally in the moment, you cannot be anxious if you are grateful. Now, you can be a second later, but if I am grateful in this moment, actually psychologically, it's impossible to be anxious and it's impossible to be self-serving. So if we find ways to be more and more authentically gracious, then actually we are creating a situation more and more in our lives and our own perspectives where it's hard to do the things or feel the things that we don't want to feel. So I love this quote. I think it's just a powerful way to kind of conceive of gratitude. So an incredible tale of gratitude. Tears were streaming down his mother's face. Just minutes earlier, he had unleashed a flurry of harsh statements and cursed at her as she stood there silently. For months, John Fopp's parents had tried to provide various options and even personal encounters with others similar to him to teach him how to do the basics, given that he was born with no arms, like dressing himself or eating without assistance or using the restroom on his own. But over and over, John had refused to open himself to these possibilities and was resigned to a life largely dependent on others. In a moment John later described as one of the most important in his life, his mother walked out of the room to leave him to put his clothes on, and he failed. About lying naked on the floor all alone, he suddenly accepted that the miracle I had so desperately wanted wasn't going to happen, i.e., I was not going to get my arms. And I also came to the point at which I realized that my anger at God had brought me no relief, only further pain. So for all of us who've been fortunate to grow up and have arms and legs, I can't imagine what John Fopp's experience has been like and what it was like as a young child. But in his book, and it's a great book, by the way, if you're ever looking for an inspiring read, he details his unlikely gratitude for the following. He says, look, I was thankful for moments of tough love and for many people that were willing to help, even if I didn't like it at the time. I was thankful for opportunities to take on new challenges, to experience natural surroundings, to know others more deeply. But most of all, it's almost hard to say, he illustrates how growing up with no arms offered him an unusual chance to discover a unique perspective, a unique calling that ultimately helped him overcome many fears and obstacles not just the ones presented by his missing appendages. What may sound really strange to some people is that John Fopp actually eventually became thankful he had no arms, even though much of his life would have been easier with them. I don't know about you, but I can't imagine that journey, that transformation that got him to that point, because the inconveniences that come along with that seem so extraordinary. And yet I'm so inspired when I read that book and I read his story that he could get to that point where he recognized that the perspective he gained was so powerful that he actually could become thankful for the disability that he had. I think that's just incredible. And so the positive effects of gratitude, we know, can have significant long-lasting impact on an individual. So again, in addition to physiological improvements, such as decreased blood pressure, improved immune functioning, gratitude has been consistently shown to improve social emotional outcomes in the area of anxiety, depression, and substance use. Even sleep seems to improve when we're more grateful. As a specific therapeutic technique, gratitude can be effective for multiple issues. In one particular study, a gratitude intervention, this was the specific intervention, was compared to 4 other positive-based strategies to determine whether each would increase levels of happiness and reduce depressive symptoms. Results indicate that in comparison to the other experimental strategies, like focusing on strengths, recognizing good things in life, the gratitude visit group far and away showed the biggest increase in happiness and decrease in depressive symptoms. So they literally did a gratitude visit where they visited someone and they gave them thanks about something that they had done for them in their life. And they found that that was the most powerful intervention of all that was listed. Studies have also consistently found that PTSD levels are negatively correlated with post-trauma gratitude, independent of how severe the trauma was, how chronic it was, and even the time that's elapsed since the traumatic event. So gratitude not only provides intrapersonal benefits for the gracious person, it also provides interpersonal connections for those who've been traumatized to maintain and expand their networks of support. That's pretty remarkable, right? It not only, let's say, for someone with PTSD can decrease their anxiety, but it can also allow them to connect better with other people so that their network of support is greater. I can't think of much more important than that idea. The first, though, key to effective gratitude is recognizing what it's not. I think this is one thing that gets kind of it's a misnomer, which is that, gratitude is not necessarily sincere or whatever. We should not falsify gratitude. We need to make sure we know what it is by recognizing what it is not. So it's not false positivity or denial of negative emotions. I said this early in the talk. Please don't minimize our negative emotions. That is not helpful for us, right? It's also not saying that things are good when they're not good. Be real. Like if it's horrible, it's horrible. But that's really those two keys. It's not condoning atrocities and maltreatment of others, even if an outcome might be good. So it's not saying like things that happen, well, if it turns out well, it must be good. No, it's not. Like if it's an atrocity, it's an atrocity. Even if someone comes to a good place, that doesn't change what happens. Like C.S. Lewis said at the beginning, it's not like saying that nothing was wrong and I'm forgiving you for something that wasn't wrong. It was really wrong, so be honest. It's also not being tragically idealistic or optimistic or blind to obvious realities, right? This is not, tragic comedy here. This is real, and we have to be real about it. And it's also not settling for less or an erosion of high standards, even if struggles highlight meaningful moments and progress that might remain hidden to untrained eyes. I want to be clear, being grateful for things doesn't mean that we're reducing standards, right? We should expect people to behave and be appropriate in ways that are really, really key, right? So this is what true gratitude is not. But what it is that the things that we really suggest, the evidence that repeated acts of gratitude, right, are embracing that which is good, even in the context of things that might not feel great, or embracing the good things that happen, even when life can be real challenging. And the key here is that there's certain strategies that appear to enhance the benefit of gratitude. So let's think about these 4 things. If you're going to use gratitude strategically, this is what you want to do. Number 1, the more details and specifics that you acknowledge and express regarding your thankfulness, the more likely gratitude will help you. So this could be like noting the specific work each member of the household has done instead of just thanking people in general for working hard. So at the end of the night, maybe your kids, there were specific things that they did well. It's important for you to be grateful and express that for those things, not just look out to the kids and say, hey, great job, guys. Thanks so much. You can do that. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, gratitude still is gratitude, but it's not going to be as effective if you're not specific. The second thing is that you have to emphasize areas of gratitude that resulted from unexpected or new circumstances, even more so than regular events that happen during the day, right? So this is really interesting. When you find things are novel or things that are unexpected, even like maybe catching a light that you never catch before, those are the ones that are particularly powerful. Again, we should be grateful for the things that are ongoing and regular, but when we find something new, it really resonates with us in a positive way. Number 3, regularly consider what life would have been like if positive events had not occurred. Like, what would it have been like if my friend had never been introduced to me as my wife? I think a lot of times we worry about what might go wrong in the future, and we take for granted the things that went right in the past. But the key element of gratitude here is to think about, gosh, what if that hadn't happened in that way? Like, how would my life have changed differently and not as positively? And when we think about that more, we'll find that the gratefulness really increases. And finally, regular journaling about gratitude, even if it's for a few days at a time, can create a discipline of happiness that can last forever. All right, so our next question for the chat is, what is something that you probably should be grateful for, but you consistently take for granted? What's something you probably should be grateful for, but you should consistently take for granted? I'll tell you mine right off the bat. This week, my eyes, I'm wearing glasses, which normally I don't wear glasses. I have contacts, but I had kind of a low-grade eye infection. It wasn't going away, so I switched over to glasses, and my eyes were bothering me. And I realized I take for granted all the time the ability to see and see well, and all the adaptations like glasses and contacts that allow me to do that. And that's something I shouldn't take for granted. That's an amazing gift, right? Like, it's been the whole week of kind of thinking about that a lot. But I can see right now, like on the chat line, we talk about my home, family, health. We talk about spending time with our adult children. I think that's a great one, right? I mean, as your kids get older, spending that time is really meaningful for me these days. My parents are 70 this last year, and spending that time now, I recognize that I should have been much more grateful for a long time because it's really a gift, right? Reliable transportation, employment, my husband's optimism in spite of his physical limitations. That's really beautiful. I appreciate that a lot. My mother's living with me, right? Having my mother so close, being able to live within my means, right? I think that's something that's easy to take for granted, but having that opportunity is wonderful. Having a flexible schedule, freedom to walk outside. I love that last one. I think about, being able to walk over to the hospital next door, and I can use the lounge there because I'm still an affiliate physician. It's a simple walk, but I'll do it right after I get off this call. And I really love that each day, cloudy or not cloudy. So lots of great examples. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that. And neighbors helping out with the kids. I love that one for sure. So, all right, last movement here, transcendence. Quote, it was not the dawn flooding the bay which woke Frederick. Rather, it was the gradual awareness of flaming words all around him. Living things that carried him down wide rivers and over mountains and across spreading plains. It was then the people who were with him, black men, very tall and big and strong. They turned up rich earth as black as their broad backs. They hunted in forests. Some of them were in cities, whole cities of black folks. For they were free. They went wherever they wished. They worked as they had planned. They even flew like birds high in the sky. He was up there with them, looking down on the earth, which seemed so small. He stretched his wings. He was strong. He could fly. He could fly in a flock of people. So this is an excerpt from a really, really powerful book called There Was Once a Slave by Shirley Graham. And it details Frederick Douglass, actually the process by which he escaped from slavery and went on to his remarkable life. And I think about this when you see this and you envision this really is kind of that vision of that full transcendence. He suffered horrific things under the slaveholders, and even upon his escape, there were multiple times where he was injured. And yet you can feel him transcending those situations and those circumstances to a place that no one could remove, right? No one could take him away from this. And so I love this passage. I think it just is a beautiful representation here. But that word transcend is an interesting word, right? And so the last, or I guess second to last, maybe question for the chat today is, when you think of the word transcend, what word or visual, don't use Google, please don't do that, immediately comes to mind? And don't censor this. When I hear the word transcend, what comes to mind instantaneously? Going beyond, to go up, right? Death, the soul leaving the body. Star Trek, summiting a mountain, overcoming, someone in a deep state of meditation, beyond your limits, moving forward, going beyond. Great. Oh man, I just love this. I love this chat today. This is so wonderful. I really appreciate this. Love and growth and rising and renewal. Isn't it interesting that a couple of the things that over and over keep coming up are the sense of movement, right? I describe these all as movements. Our world is predicated on movement. Everything is moving. Even the table is moving because the electrons are circling at ridiculous speeds. All transcendence is, and there's an element of movement, of shifting that is occurring. It's never something like static or in inertia, right? And so I think that's what you're capturing here so wonderfully, is this idea of movement. But well, what does it mean to transcend, right? Is it the sense of rising above, as someone said on the chat line, beyond the ordinary physical and psychological state? Is it an awareness that something more exists beyond the palpable struggle that we're in the middle of, right? Is it finding or making meaning of challenges or difficulties in a way that creates greater strength and resiliency, which can include the following mechanisms, whether it's through reasoning or understanding, through action, through spirituality? A growing body of research suggests that the transcendent experiences are both more common than we previously believed and actually really beneficial for psychological health, especially at an older age. And I would argue that we're actually constantly using transcendence in some ways. Like, when you stub your toe and you're walking and it's kind of painful, if you stay in that pain all the time, that's really, really difficult. But if we get outside of that, we think about other people in pain, or we're focused on something else, in some ways we are transcending there in regards to how we're dealing with the situation in front of us. So I wanted to share, a couple of things around this, and I wanted to share kind of a personal example. This is on such a small scale, and so many of you have transcended in ways that would be beautiful to share. But this comes out of just years ago. I've been presenting on this topic. I write a lot about pain and pain management and stuff. And so I had this situation where we had friends come in from Cleveland, and we had gone to get our, with 8 kids, we call it our bus, but our NV, our Nissan NV. And as I was pulling a sliding door shut on a hillside, like on a hill near my mother-in-law's house, I grabbed the frame of the door. And what I didn't realize was, as I grabbed it, my friend slamming the door shut. And all of a sudden I realized, my finger's in the door. I can't get it out. It's stuck. It was a pretty painful experience. And so something I really began to think about this that night. So I'm in pain. I'm realizing my finger's probably broke. And the next morning I had a half marathon I had trained for. Fortunately, I don't need my, my middle finger for the half marathon to run. And I started thinking, you know what? I've been talking all about pain and writing about pain. Maybe this is an opportunity to transcend and really trust the process here. And so I decided to kind of forego any pain med or anything at that point. And the next morning, the half marathon, I started to really focus on the people in my life who were going through a lot of pain. At that time, my dad was going through a hip replacement. He was having back problems. My Aunt Joni had frontal temporal dementia, and she was really going through a difficult time with language and a lot of other basic kind of faculties. And so as I immersed myself in that half marathon, I began to really, really try to transcend and connect with them. And it's not that the pain, eventually, to be honest, my finger kind of went numb, but it's not that it went away, but I found myself so connected with them that it changed me. It changed my experience. And so then later, once, a couple of days later, they found out it was not only broke, but the bone had been displaced. I had to have a procedure for it. And initially, they were just going to put me under general anesthetic, but I thought to myself, again, maybe this is a chance to transcend. Maybe this is a chance. And so they allowed me to do it with just local anesthetic. And as I was getting ready, and they were getting ready to give me the shot and go into surgery there, And I was reading about these Civil War soldiers who had amputations with little or no anesthetic. And I thought, gosh, if they could do this, like this can happen. We can do this, right? And so that was kind of like the thought I transcended with into that surgery, which went well. And then after the surgery, my friend Greg had a back surgery. And I really began to connect with him through this process. All this to say, all of these experiences, I really believe allowed me to forgo any pain medication at all and ultimately lessened my experience of the pain. And through it, I found meaning in the suffering. I found that, when both my thoughts and actions connected me with other people that had way worse than I did, that by putting myself in that place with others' experiences, my pain no longer felt just like my own, but it felt like we were sharing this experience together. So just one small experience, but something that really resonated around this idea. All right, so the last question for the chat, I promise, is we've done the 5 movements, right? We've talked about forgiveness, right? We've talked about gratitude, helping others, and I'm blanking on one, and transcendence there. And what I wanted to ask this last chat here is we're going to go into the kind of the final segment. And the question here is, why do you think that the suicide rate for adolescents and young adults today is 2 to 2.5 times more than it was during the Great Depression? I'll explain why I'm asking this question. But as we've gone through all the movements, right? We've gone through, all 5 of them. Well, I see social media. That's a big one, right? Popping up. Why is this possible? The Great Depression, we had so little of everything available. Social media, too much pressure, unrealistic expectations, right? More information is readily available via the internet, unable to process through coping mechanisms. More data. Lots of questions, right? What is it? What's going on here? What's happening? Well, the reason I bring this up as we get into this final segment is, despite everything I've described to you, there's a struggle for meaning and finding ways to flourish that exists in our country today. So despite research that suggests most people, even in the most difficult situations, do find meaning in life, which is great, studies indicate that only 1 in 5 people are actually flourishing. And I really believe that the research and personal experience suggests that 3 primary reasons exist to why this is the case. Now, again, all the mechanisms you described, like social media and other things, are contributing, but I would actually argue it's 3 reasons that we really come down at the core level that impact this. So number 1 is that so many times we engage in self-blame. And adolescents today, when they compare themselves in social media, compare themselves in so many ways, they are blaming themselves, they're envious, they don't feel good, their image is poor, as contrasted with a sense of self-worth. Now, I'm not talking about being narcissistic or inflated self-esteem. What we're saying here is that it appears that self-blame is an epidemic, right? It is just really a pandemic in itself, as contrasted with self-worth. And so although we recognize that all of us are going to commit mistakes and transgressions, the manifestation of self-worth invokes an understanding that each person is worthy of that of another, only expressed in a unique way, right? So if you lead, you're influencing people by your life. Maybe a helper is influencing them by their heart. Sufferers get influenced by their witness, but all lives have great meaning. And it appears that really in our society today, we struggle to find the self-worth that we all have. And we often engage in so much self-blame overall that leads us to a negative place. The second thing is that research has consistently found that attitudes must be accompanied by daily practices and environmental adjustments to provide a framework for a happier, healthier existence, right? So if you've experienced the horrors of trauma, you have to directly and repeatedly contradict them by habits of contentment, right? So what I'm saying here is that in general, I think we're struggling to really enact the lifestyle, the habits, the daily process in ways that is life-giving. And very often we find ourselves scattered. We don't know what to do. And maybe we're going after outcomes. I think that many ways, especially the young adults and adolescents of today, they're going after all the outcomes they want, right? They want certain status, or they want some, financially or whatever it is. And instead, they're not adopting a process for life that really is sound in the way our bodies and minds are designed. So I think research really indicates we have to find daily practices and environmental adjustments, kind of like we've been talking about in this talk, to utilize. But I would argue above all, even above self-blame and habitual practices, it appears that one factor looms above them all. And this issue really serves to bury many people kind of in the catacombs of their own selves and enables generations of trauma to ensue. And it's really the factor of fear. I mentioned at the very, very beginning that the number one psychological complaint for kids and adolescents in this nation and worldwide is anxiety, right? And in order to find meaning and transcendence, aspects of forgiveness, channeling, altruism, gratitude are necessary, even in very difficult situations. But we're really confronting in all of this the factor of fear, right? It's again, fear is important, and often it is a messenger to say, hey, be cautious, be careful, right? It's informing us of where we need to be wary. But fear left I guess it's the fear that overtakes us just really doesn't allow us to see the great things that are around us, doesn't allow us to feel the love that we want to feel. And so in general, we have to kind of consider what's going on in our society that we really have to directly contradict and confront. And I really think that these three areas are significant areas. So in the end here, as we kind of wrap up and we have time for questions, this idea of turning distress into joy, I hope you didn't come on today and think it was just going to be a linear 5-step process, although I certainly gave you 5 of what I feel like are keys. But really, in reality, it's a continual, dynamic, whole being engagement that must involve the 4 dimensions of our being: the physical, psychological, social, and spiritual, transcendent, metaphysical aspects. All of those together are the ways that we can turn distress into joy. And the more each dimension of ourselves participates in each movement, the more I believe healing will occur and joy will come. And so I kind of developed this mnemonic. I hope that this is something maybe you can take away to think of the 5 elements: the forgiveness, channeling, which I was forgetting earlier, helping others, gratitude, and transcendence. So it's FCHGT. And the mnemonic is forever creating hope, growing together. Can you imagine a society founded on these ideas? Can you imagine that we really, like if these were our primary areas of focus every day, to forgive others, to channel our energy into positive things, to volunteer, to help those who need it, to give gratitude, and to transcend difficult situations? I mean, I know that's up high in the sky, but the remarkable transformation of not just a person or a family, but a community or a country would be beyond what we could even imagine. So at the end of the day, as I kind of wrap up, and I want to tell you about a few additional resources, I just want to say thanks so much for giving me the time and the platform to do this. This is really a joy. I think that, for all the divisiveness that exists, for all the negativity that exists in the world, we have great opportunities to come together, collaborate, and show the goodness that is really out there and that's inherent with ourselves. And so a few other resources just to kind of give you there's actually a series on my website called Turning Distress into Joy. And it gets into these elements even a little bit deeper in different ways, and so you can check that out. The website itself has over 250 articles and series, and again, all of them are designed in some way to promote greater health, harmony, and happiness. I published 5 books, 2 of which I think that you'd really particularly be interested in around this topic. One's called Holiness with the WH, and it's the unified pursuit of health, harmony, happiness, and heaven. And the other is Confessions of a Carless Commuter: What 40,000 Motorless Miles Taught Me About Life. And I've actually been commuting to work by bike or running or even the bus sometimes for the last 15 plus years. And so what I realized along the way was that there were so many lessons I was learning on the road that pertained to everyday life. And so Confessions of a Carless Commuter is kind of just a brief but fun look at how those lessons overlay with everything that we do. And I know Jeff at the beginning mentioned I have a podcast that's called Living a Whole Christian Life. It is actually 52 episodes for the 52 weeks of the year, and they're only about 15 to 20 minutes. You can find it on my website or Apple or Google. If you happen to check it out, definitely kind of start at the beginning, because each element or each episode builds off the other. And the last thing, if you believe in the mission that I'm really talking about today, I really ask a favor of you in addition to those other resources and books, and that is that by Valentine's Day, we hope that my newest book and co-author, myself and she, that's available, which is called Turning Free Will into Willpower: The Opportunity of a Lifetime. And so it should be available in a couple weeks on Amazon if you're willing to put even an alarm on your phone for February 14th to check it out. The target audience is Christian parents, but honestly, it's really designed to be useful for all parents and people in general, even if faith isn't important and not an element of your life. what I say here in the synopsis is that there's countless personal factors that we have no control over, such as our age, origin, genetics, and even our family. And on any given day, most of us have little or no influence over many external factors, whether it be weather, astrological patterns, right, cloudiness and things like that, cultural, societal trends, politics, and economic fluctuations. But what science, theology, and experience all agree is that on every waking hour, all of us have a great deal of control over the decisions we make, which has a dramatic impact on the lives, our lives, and that of others. And these decisions are our greatest opportunity to pursue goodness, meaning, and contentment. Yet why do we struggle so much to harness the incredible potential of the free will required to make them? So this book really synthesizes those three areas with the hope that we can really harness the possibilities and promise of turning free will into willpower. So I'd love for if you check that out. I'd love even if you pass it on to others, get a couple books, continue the conversation, because today more than ever, we need to know how to use our free will in positive ways. And so then finally, just selected citations and links that you guys have available, and there's much more on my website. But I want to say thanks as I open it up to questions, because it's really been a joy again to bring this to you this morning. So with that, Jeff, we can kind of open up any questions that we have. People can certainly open up their mics, or by the way, James, is that James or Jay? It's james-schrader.com is the website. So James dash and then my last name Schrader, SCHROEDER.com. So.
And Dr. Schrader, we had a request earlier. I know you're allowing us to record this, and this will be available on our website, but are you willing or able to share the PowerPoint slides that we could share with people?
Yep, 100%. I'm going to send those through to Kathy right afterwards, and then she can send those out. And yeah, you guys, please use them, send them anywhere. This is really a collective mission that we're all part of. And I don't think there's anybody in this world, and certainly no one in this audience today, that doesn't want to be happier, healthier, and more harmonious. So yep, we can go for it.
So as Dr. Schrader said, please feel free to come off mute or put in the chat any questions you have. To me, this really goes to the idea of taking care of ourselves so we're available to take care of others. I mean, it's putting the mask on in the airplane on yourself first so that you then can help others. And so you've equipped us with a lot of ideas and thoughts and just musings to help shift our mindset and maybe be more well-equipped to help others and be ready to help others and avoid those things that can contribute to a sense of overwhelm.
So I see one question on the chat, Jeff, while we're kind of waiting, and sorry if I cut anybody off there. There was a great question here about, as I listen to your talk, there's much useful information, and I have a talented, intelligent 14-year-old granddaughter who's often depressed and anxious. In essence, the question is, how, and there's another adolescent involved, both girls love to read. Is there one or two books that you would recommend for teenage girls such as these two that would help them with channeling and gratitude? That is a great question. I'm trying to think of really good books, and maybe if some of you have ideas out there, even fictional books that are really good. I will say this, and I don't mean to plug myself, but that Confessions of a Carless Commuter is 100 pages, very simple read. It's kind of a fun read to look at, like, okay, he's biking, but like, how does this relate to kind of everyday life? It's something I wanted to write for all audiences. It's an easy read for a teen, and my kids actually read it, and they're like, hey, Dad, it's not too bad. Thanks, guys, I appreciate it. But when it comes to teens, I will have to think on that and get back to you about what are some ideas for books. I think there's a lot of inspiring stories out there that, one of the neat stories, in fact, I can think of this recently. Here's a good book, is that, has anybody seen the movie Boys in the Boat? That was a recent movie that came out about the Olympic rowing team, right? And that book is a really, really inspiring book that I think talks about the idea of channeling some difficult situations, difficult experiences in a real positive way, but also being grateful for opportunities that you may not have had. The protagonist of that story obviously had a real difficult situation during, I think it was actually during the Great Depression. And I thought that was a beautiful book, and the way it kind of displayed, how to be resilient and work through, but give gratitude. So there's actually a lot of books out there, and sometimes we just kind of have to step back, and I'm sitting in the moment, not coming up with great ideas beyond the ones I've given you. But I think it's a great consideration. We need to be able to inspire our teens. The other thing I will say about the new book coming out is there's a lot of stories in there that are inspiring stories about all of these elements. And we really wanted to be inspiring because we all need motivation in all of our lives. So what other questions?
Dr. Schrader, I saw someone asking again for the name of the book you referenced.
Yeah, so The Boys in the Boat is that name of the book. And again, there's a really neat movie that's out right now, or was out in the last few weeks. But I think it was it was in the 30s. It was a rowing team, a college rowing team that I won't tell the full story, but went on the Olympics and has kind of a really neat perspective there. So. I see Carmen said, I made a comment on the chat that I don't volunteer because I use that free time for my own family. Is that selfish of me? Well, I think I really appreciate your openness and honesty about that question. And first, I would say that volunteering, often we think of it instantly as occurring outside of our home. But really, the idea of the research behind here is helping others, including those closest to you, has great, great benefits, right? And I would just say that every person has to kind of discern where they're most called. I mean, many people in their own homes have plenty of need and plenty of ways to help out that is fully enough, right? I mean, it's enough. I said that earlier about the volunteering. You can exceed the capacity to the point where it's not healthy. So if you're doing too much, that's not a good thing too, right? What I think the focus is on is how much am I really giving of others? And sometimes the focus is on how much am I giving to others in ways that maybe are hard for me, right? So that, I mentioned before about the forgiveness idea. It's an altruistic gift. And you'll find, and I've certainly found in my life, the harder it is to give a gift, probably the more meaningful it is for everyone involved, right? And so I really appreciate that question. And it's certainly a judgment I can't make. I think it's something that you have to kind of decide for yourself. But in the end of the day, whoever we help, however we help them, remains very much an important thing.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Schrader, when we were talking before the session began, I referenced a course at Yale University called The Science of Well-Being, and it became their most popular class. And it's actually available. I'm on the Coursera site right now, so if you're not familiar with Coursera, it's Coursera, COURSERA.org, and it's still available for free. And I found it very, very insightful to kind of build on some of the concepts you touched on today. So I want to say it's 8 or 10 sessions long, has activities and things, and then it has homework you can do. So just a nice way and a free way to build upon what you've given us as a nice foundation today.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that, Jeff. Yeah, and you know how I feel. It's such a great thing. And I think one of the unfortunate things in the past in our mental health field and psychology field is that we focus too much on what was going wrong, too much on pathology, too much on abnormal areas, and we didn't focus enough on what was going right and what we could do well and how we could be resilient. And I love that movement these days. We're focusing on the idea like, hey, things are tough. We get it. We understand. But like, there's so much good stuff. There's so much available. Why don't we focus on that too? And that's life-giving in doing that. So I see Sheila had a question. What was the book that he wrote called? I think and it'll be on the slides. The newest one, again, is Turning Free Will into Willpower. It'll be available on Amazon in a couple weeks. So that's the newest one there. Let's see. I see one question. I enjoyed learning about ways. Sorry, Jeff, if I'm cutting in here on you. I'm just kind of reading it myself. So one question I have from the beginning of the presentation is in regards to forgiveness. Is there any research or advice to help with finding forgiveness towards people who do not show remorse or seem to have sadistic pride? Well, I think that's super difficult. And I understand that's often where we can find a real block. But what I want to go back to that question to say is, remember first and foremost, forgiving is not about the other person. Now that may sound really weird to you, but it's not about the other person first and foremost. It has to start with an intrapersonal process. So what I mean here is, you may look at them and always feel like, oh, I can't forgive them. Well, at the end of the day, it's about you recreating and developing that capacity within yourself to move into a better place no matter what's happened, right? And so you might never decide that reconciling with that person is a good thing. I mean, that maybe that's not what is intended here, right? But I think if we focus on the intrapersonal part of it, we'll recognize that I need to at least give that gift to myself, right? At least to myself. And if you decide to give the altruistic gift to the other person, even though they're sadistic and not remorseful, that's your decision. But don't forget the intrapersonal process is where we need to be. And so that's what I would say to that question there.
Excellent.
Other questions? I'm going to go silent for a second, and we just have a couple minutes left. Anybody that wants to have an audio question too, feel free.
I will take a moment to remind you that we have 2 more webinar series presentations on the next 2 Fridays. So February 9th at the same time, 11 to 1 p.m. Eastern time, and then February 16th at 11 to 1 p.m. Eastern time. And those can be accessed or can be registered for by going to the Prevent Child Abuse Indiana website at pcain.org. They are free, and it'll drop you onto our landing page, and it should be in the banner at the very top of the page how you can register.
And Jeff, as we close out, and I talked about gratitude today, and I want to just express my gratitude for PCAIN and everything that you're doing throughout the state. Truly, it's amazing, right? This is the free resources, the mission. I mean, as a parent, as a psychologist, is there anything more important than preventing child abuse in Indiana? Is there anything more important than making sure that our kids have the lives that we desire for them? I can't think of things more important. So it's just really remarkable what you guys are doing, and I've really enjoyed just kind of work with your organization over the years. So wanted to say that.
Thank you.
Well, I think it looks like maybe it's time to go and say goodbye. But again, thanks so much for being on today. I know this can be a heavy topic at times. I know this maybe hits you in particular ways, but I also know that we desire greater happiness, harmony, and health across the board. And if you believe in that, even contact me, after this presentation. Feel free to reach out through my website. You can find me anywhere online. You can find my email. It's not hard. It's all out there. But I really so believe in this mission. And I also believe that if we don't intentionally do things to promote this mission, other things which we don't desire will take over. And so we have to use our time well. And so hope you all have a great day. And thanks for being on the call today.
Thank you. Hope to see you all next week.
Thank you.